Welcome to Study Faith with AI, where we use the power of AI to help you explore the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints.
I'm Meg Jensen.
And I'm Paul Carter.
And we're Google AIs. Whether you're a lifelong member or just starting to learn about the church, we're here to dive deep into its history, beliefs, and culture.
So if you're ready to learn, you're in the right place.
That's right.
Let's get started. Welcome back to the Deep Dive. Today we're diving into the Book of Mormon. Looks like you've sent us a ton of research about it.
It does seem like you're interested in whether the Book of Mormon is an authentic record.
Definitely. Even for someone already familiar with the Book of Mormon, these sources bring up some really interesting points.
What's fascinating is they address the skepticism head-on. You know, a lot of people see it as a product of the 19th century.
Okay, so why do so many scholars dismiss the Book of Mormon?
Well, the origin story is a lot to take in, isn't it? A young man translating an ancient record with divine power.
Right. That does seem like a big claim. So how did the sources address that?
They don't shy away from it. Instead, they argue that just because mainstream scholars don't accept it doesn't mean there's no evidence. They point out that the Book of Mormon itself has tons of details about ancient cultures and events, stuff that can actually be examined.
So they're saying, let's look at what's actually in the Book of Mormon.
Exactly. And they bring up some really interesting stuff, like, have you ever heard of chiasmus?
Chiasmus. Yeah, I think so. Can you remind me what that is, and how does it connect to the Book of Mormon?
It's like a mirror in the text. Phrases and ideas are mirrored. It creates a sort of symmetry. And it's something you find in ancient Hebrew texts. Well, guess what? It's all over the Book of Mormon.
Wow. Are they saying Joseph Smith was using this ancient Hebrew technique on purpose?
It's a little more complicated than that. They don't necessarily think he was consciously aware of it. They suggest that chiasmus in the Book of Mormon might point to an older source, maybe even an ancient source.
That makes sense. If someone wanted to argue that he made it all up, they'd also have to explain how this ancient literary technique ended up in there. Do they give any examples of chiasmus in the book?
Oh, yeah. One of the sources, Chapter 3 by Noel B. Reynolds, goes into detail about chiasmus in 1 Nephi. He points out these intricate patterns across entire chapters. It's pretty remarkable.
Wow, so it's not just a couple of random instances. It sounds like it's woven into the entire text. What else do these sources talk about?
One takes a totally different approach. They use statistical analysis to look at the authorship of the Book of Mormon.
Hold on. How can you use statistics to study a religious text?
It's called stylometry. Basically, researchers look at things like how often words appear and the patterns they make. And you know what? They found evidence for multiple authors in the Book of Mormon.
Wait, multiple authors? Does that mean they're saying Joseph Smith didn't write it?
It's not that simple. Remember, the Book of Mormon itself says it's a compilation of different records written by different prophets. So what these researchers are saying is that the analysis backs that up. It's like a choir of voices, just like it claims to be.
So instead of one author, it actually supports the idea that it's compiled from all these different sources.
Exactly. It makes the idea that it's a simple 19th century fabrication much harder to believe.
This is getting really interesting. Ancient Hebrew literary structures and statistical analysis. It sounds like there's a lot to unpack here. What else is in these sources?
You've also got some material about Lehi's journey across the Arabian desert, remember. It's an incredible story, but definitely raises some questions.
You're telling me.
Yeah.
That journey is fascinating, but I get why some people might be skeptical. What do the sources say about it?
Well, they highlight some recent research on ancient caravan routes and the geography of the Arabian Peninsula. And there are some striking correlations with the Book of Mormon.
So you're saying there's actual evidence to support the route that Lehi and his family might have taken?
Yeah. There's evidence. The book talks about pomegranate trees, for example.
Pomegranate trees?
Yeah. It mentions how they were used for making bows in specific areas and how hard it was to find good wood for building in other areas.
Okay.
And get this. That all matches up perfectly with what we know about the region today.
Wow, it's like the Book of Mormon was ahead of its time, you know?
Yeah.
Anticipating discoveries that wouldn't be made for centuries.
It really makes you think. And it gets even deeper. Your sources also go into the environmental details mentioned in the Book of Mormon, like the specific types of trees and plants and how difficult it was to find water in certain places. All of it lines up with what we know about the region now.
This is convincing. It seems like the more we learn about the ancient world, the more the Book of Mormon's details fall into place.
Right, and it makes you want to keep learning and exploring, to see the Book of Mormon in a new light.
Absolutely. Speaking of new perspectives, a lot of people say the Book of Mormon just reflects 19th century American ideas. Do the sources address that at all?
They do, and it's a fascinating counterargument. Chapter 8 by Richard Bushman, he acknowledges that any text will share some things with the culture it comes from, but he argues that there are some big differences between the themes in the Book of Mormon and what was popular in Joseph Smith's America.
Like, for example, what kind of themes are different?
Well, for example, the way the Book of Mormon talks about kings. You'd think someone writing in 19th century America, after the whole American Revolution thing, would be totally against kings.
Yeah, that's true. You'd expect a strong anti-monarchy message.
But the Book of Mormon is much more nuanced. It shows the good and the bad. It even includes times when the people wanted a king, which goes against that typical American story of rejecting kings.
That makes you think. It challenges the idea that the Book of Mormon is simply a product of its time.
Exactly. It makes you wonder where these ideas really came from.
This is incredibly fascinating. Ancient literary structures, statistical analysis, even evidence for Lehi's journey. So much to consider. But at the end of the day, the translation relies on Joseph Smith and his scribe, Oliver Cowdery. What do your sources say about their credibility?
That's a great question, and a really important one. Your sources looked at historical records, letters, journals, even accounts from people who knew Joseph and Oliver personally. They're trying to understand these men and what motivated them.
So they're not just taking their word for it.
Not at all. They're going deeper. And what they found is a picture of two men who, even with all the scrutiny and criticism, stuck with their story their entire lives. They always said the translation was divine. They always said the plates were real. They never backed down.
Wow. That says a lot about their sincerity, right?
Yeah.
It's one thing to make a claim, but it's another to stick to it for years, even when people are against you. Makes you think about what could have motivated them to hold on so strongly, even when it cost them so much.
It's a fascinating question. And it's one your sources really encourage us to think about. They seem to be saying that to understand the Book of Mormon, you need to understand the people who brought it forth.
It's easy to get caught up in the arguments, but it all comes down to people, doesn't it? Their experiences, their beliefs, their struggles.
Absolutely. And your sources recognize that. They recognize that the Book of Mormon is a product of real people trying to figure out faith, history, and revelation. And that's something worth exploring.
You're right. It's making me see the Book of Mormon in a totally new way. Not just as a book, but as a window into a specific time, a specific place, and the experiences of the people who lived then.
That's what makes this deep dive so great. We're not just picking apart arguments, we're exploring the human experience, right? All woven into a book that still has an impact on people centuries later.
Okay, we've touched on a lot. Scholarly skepticism, ancient literary forms, statistical analysis, even the geography of Lehi's journey. But let's get back to basics. Your sources say there's a lot of potential evidence inside the Book of Mormon. Where do they suggest we start looking?
They point out that even though many scholars think the Book of Mormon is a made-up story from the 19th century, there's actually a lot of potential evidence inside the text itself that could be tested scientifically.
What kind of evidence are we talking about?
Well, the Book of Mormon talks about an ancient people, right? Their culture, their history, even the geography of where they lived. All of that can be compared to what we know about the ancient world from archaeology, linguistics, and all those other fields.
So it's not just a story. It actually has specific details that can be investigated and maybe even proven.
Exactly. Your sources seem to be saying that most scholars haven't even bothered to look at those details. They're just quick to dismiss the whole thing.
It's like they're saying, don't just dismiss it, actually look at the evidence.
Yeah, that's the idea. And one of the first places they suggest looking is chiasmus.
Chiasmus. We talked about that briefly before. Can you remind us what it is and why it's so important?
Sure. Remember, chiasmus is that pattern of mirrored phrases and ideas that create symmetry in a text. It's been found in ancient Hebrew writings, and you know what? It's all over the Book of Mormon, too.
So are they saying Joseph Smith, who didn't have much formal education, was using this complex technique on purpose?
It's more nuanced than that. They're suggesting that the presence of chiasmus in the Book of Mormon could point to a much older source for the text.
Okay, so give me an example. How does chiasmus actually work in the Book of Mormon?
Okay, so one of your sources, specifically Chapter 3 by Noel B. Reynolds, analyzes the book of 1st Nephi. He breaks down how the book is structured, and he points out these intricate patterns of mirrored phrases and ideas. And get this, they span across entire chapters. It's pretty impressive.
So it's not just a few random instances of chiasmus here and there. It's like a deliberate literary structure woven into the whole book.
Yeah, that's what the research suggests, and it raises a big question. How could Joseph Smith, who didn't know much about ancient literature, have done this?
Right. It's one thing to say he made up the story, but to explain how he embedded it within this ancient literary form, that's a different story.
Exactly. And that's where your sources start to build their case for the Book of Mormon's authenticity. They're saying the evidence, whether it's chiasmus and these other details, points to something more than just a made-up story from the 19th century.
It's like we're uncovering a mystery, all these clues that challenge our initial assumptions.
That's what makes this deep dive so exciting. We're not just accepting or rejecting ideas, we're actively engaging with the evidence.
I totally agree. It makes me wonder, if chiasmus is in the Book of Mormon, what other ancient literary or cultural elements are hiding in the text? It's a treasure hunt.
I know, right? And your sources basically say there's tons of potential evidence out there waiting to be discovered, as long as we're willing to look for it.
Okay, hold on. Before we go too far down that road, let's talk about authorship again. You said that one of your sources used statistical analysis to identify multiple authors in the Book of Mormon. How does that work?
It's called stylometry. It analyzes things like word frequencies, sentence structures, those kinds of linguistic patterns, and it helps distinguish different authors.
It's like a linguistic fingerprint analysis, right?
Exactly. And when they applied stylometry to the Book of Mormon, they found distinct patterns that suggest multiple authors, which, remember, lines up with the book's claim that it's a compilation of ancient records.
That's a good point. The statistical analysis supports multiple authors and supports the Book of Mormon's own narrative.
Exactly. It really challenges the idea that Joseph Smith was the only author, that he just made it all up.
Right. It adds another layer of complexity.
Yeah.
It makes you wonder if maybe Joseph Smith's role was more like a translator or compiler than an author in the traditional sense.
That's a really interesting thought, and that's something your sources encourage us to consider.
Okay, so we've got chiasmus, stylometry, and probably a lot more we haven't even uncovered yet. What else do your sources say about the Book of Mormon's authenticity?
They also address one of the biggest criticisms, that it's just a reflection of American ideas and culture from the 19th century.
Oh yeah, you hear that one a lot.
Yeah.
How do they counter that argument?
They have a few different approaches. First, they acknowledge that there's bound to be some overlap. You can't totally separate a text from its environment.
That makes sense.
Right. But then they point out some key differences between the Book of Mormon's themes and what was popular in Joseph Smith's America. They talk about the Book of Mormon's view of kings, for example.
Oh yeah, we talked about that. It's definitely not the simple all kings are bad message you might expect from someone writing right after the American Revolution.
Exactly. And they argue that this nuanced view suggests a deeper set of influences that go way beyond 19th century America.
So they're saying that the ideas about government and society in the Book of Mormon are actually pretty different from the ideas that were common in Joseph Smith's time.
That's their argument. And they have other examples, too.
I'm curious about those other examples. What else sets the Book of Mormon apart from the ideas of that time?
Well, they talk about how the Book of Mormon handles social issues. Slavery, for example. Its perspective on slavery is very different from the divided views in 19th century America.
That's a tough topic, especially given the historical context. How does the Book of Mormon address it?
It condemns slavery, flat out. It sees it as a moral abomination. Now, that aligns with the abolitionist movement at the time, right? But the Book of Mormon goes further. It presents a theological argument against slavery. It's rooted in the idea that all people are children of God.
That's interesting. It's a moral stance that makes sense to us today, but it's based on a theological framework that goes way back, way before 19th century America.
Exactly. And that's what your sources are getting at. The Book of Mormon's values and perspectives on things like slavery are different, often more complex than the common ideas in Joseph Smith's time.
Okay, I'm starting to see a pattern here. It's not just about a few specific details. It's about a whole different way of looking at the world.
That's it. Your sources say this difference in worldview is really important evidence for the Book of Mormon's authenticity. Think about it. If Joseph Smith made this all up, why would he create something that challenged the ideas of his own culture?
Makes you wonder where this alternative worldview came from.
Right. And that's exactly the question your sources leave us with. They don't claim to have all the answers, but they're saying the Book of Mormon is probably more than just a product of its time.
This is all so interesting. It makes me want to reread the Book of Mormon with a fresh perspective. Pay attention to these details we've been talking about.
I know, it's like an invitation to discover something new.
Okay, before we wrap up this part, I want to get back to the translation process itself.
Of course, that's
Yeah.
a big one. And your sources go into detail about it. They focus on the accounts of how it happened, especially the roles of Joseph Smith and Oliver Cowdery.
So they're not just looking at the text itself, they're also trying to understand the people behind it.
Exactly. They're using Joseph and Oliver's own accounts, documents from that time, even memories from people who knew them. They want to paint a full picture of the translation process.
Sounds like they're trying to be thorough and careful.
They are. And what comes out of their research is a picture of two men who, even when people doubted them, stuck to their stories their whole lives.
So they didn't just say they translated the Book of Mormon. They held on to that story even when it was difficult, even when it could have been dangerous.
Exactly. Your sources say this consistency is really important. If Joseph and Oliver had just made it all up, they probably would have changed their story at some point, especially with all the opposition they faced.
That's a good point. It must have taken a lot of conviction to stick to that story, even when it cost them so much. What could have motivated them to hold on so tightly? What did they believe in so strongly?
That's the big question, isn't it? And your sources really wrestle with it. They look at the spiritual experiences Joseph and Oliver said they had, the sacrifices they made, their unwavering belief in their mission.
So they were driven by something bigger than themselves.
That's a great way to put it. And they're not trying to simplify things. They acknowledge that it's complex. Trying to figure out how faith and reason fit together, how historical evidence and personal testimony can both be true. It's not about easy answers. It's about thinking deeply about these ideas.
I like that. It's refreshing to have a discussion about the Book of Mormon that doesn't try to oversimplify things or force a conclusion.
I agree. It shows how thorough and honest your sources are. And it reflects how complex the Book of Mormon really is. It's a book that makes you think deeply and consider things carefully. And your sources are giving us the tools to do just that.
Well said. But honestly, there are still some pretty big questions about the whole translation process.
You're right. A lot of people struggle with how Joseph Smith said he translated the Book of Mormon. It seems a little unconventional, to say the least.
Yeah, the whole Urim and Thummim thing, it sounds like something straight out of an Indiana Jones movie.
I know, right? And your sources address that head on. They actually talk about the historical context of the Urim and Thummim, you know, how it's mentioned in the Old Testament.
So they're saying it wasn't just some random idea Joseph Smith came up with, that it's rooted in ancient religious practices.
Exactly. They point out that the Urim and Thummim, as described in the Bible, was used by prophets and priests to receive revelation. It was a way for them to communicate with God.
Okay, so even if it was a real thing in ancient times, how does that connect to Joseph Smith and the Book of Mormon?
Well, your sources suggest that Joseph Smith was basically restoring that ancient practice. They believe that God chose to use a method that was already part of biblical history.
So it's like God was using a familiar language, using symbols and tools that Joseph Smith would have recognized from his own religious background.
That's a great way to put it. And it makes sense to a lot of people. It helps them understand how God might have revealed an ancient text to a prophet in the 1800s.
I see what you mean. But honestly, I think a lot of people would still have trouble believing that you could translate an entire book using objects like that, even if there is a historical context.
It's definitely not something we can fully explain, and your sources don't try to. They don't offer a scientific explanation for how the Urim and Thummim worked. They acknowledge the mystery of it.
So they're saying it takes faith to accept Joseph Smith's account.
They are, and they're not afraid to say that. They say you have to decide whether you believe God can work through methods that we might not understand to accomplish his purposes.
It's interesting. They're not ignoring the challenges, but they're also asking us to think differently, to consider that miracles can happen, even if we don't fully understand how.
That's a good point. And, you know, that idea comes up a lot in your sources. They're asking us to think outside of our own limited understanding, to consider that God's power and wisdom might work in ways that we can't even grasp.
It's a big concept to wrap your head around, for sure. Let's shift gears a bit. What about Lehi's journey, the one across the Arabian desert? It's always been fascinating to me.
It's a crazy story. And your sources address it too. They talk about the potential for actual historical and geographical evidence to support the journey.
Wait, are they saying it wasn't just a symbolic story? That it could have actually happened in the real world?
They are. They talk about research that's been done on ancient caravan routes and the geography of the Arabian Peninsula.
Okay, now we're talking. What kind of research? How does it connect to Lehi's story?
Well, they talk about the discovery of ancient trails all across the Arabian desert. These trails connected different settlements and oases. For centuries, caravans used these trails, so Lehi and his family could have followed them too.
So it wasn't just an empty, impossible desert. There were actually paths people use regularly.
Exactly. And the cool thing is, the way the Book of Mormon describes Lehi's journey lines up pretty well with what we know about these routes.
Okay, give me an example. What kind of details match up?
Well, the Book of Mormon mentions a place called Nahom. That's where Lehi's group stopped to bury one of their companions. Recent research has found a possible location for Nahom, and it lines up with what the Book of Mormon says about where they were traveling and how long it took them to get there.
So it's not just a random name. It could be a real place that actually fits the timeline and the geography of the story.
That's what the research suggests. And your sources say this is just one piece of evidence that could support the idea that Lehi's journey really happened.
Wow. It's like we're retracing the steps of an ancient prophet using modern-day archaeology and geography.
It really is amazing. It shows how much work scholars are doing to try to understand the Book of Mormon as a historical document.
So we've got ancient caravan routes and a possible location for Nahom. What other evidence do they talk about?
They also look at the environmental details mentioned in the Book of Mormon. For example, it describes them finding a specific type of tree that was good for making bows.
A tree for making bows.
Yeah, and get this. Modern botanists have confirmed that that type of tree actually grew in the region where Lehi's group would have been traveling.
So Joseph Smith, writing in the 1800s, just happened to pick a tree that actually existed in that exact spot centuries earlier.
It would be a huge coincidence, wouldn't it? It's a detail that Joseph Smith couldn't have known about, but it matches perfectly with what we know about the plants of that area.
This is blowing my mind. The more we learn about the ancient world, the more the Book of Mormon seems to fit.
That's what makes this research so exciting. Your sources believe that if we keep studying the archaeology, geography, and languages of the ancient Near East, we'll find even more evidence to support the Book of Mormon.
Okay, but I gotta ask, do they address any of the problems with Lehi's story? Because the Arabian desert is a harsh place. I'm sure some people would question how they could have survived such a long journey.
Oh, absolutely. Your sources don't shy away from the challenges. They admit that there are things that are still hard to explain, like how did they survive in such a rough environment for so long? It's not like they had a bunch of supplies and a map.
So they're not pretending everything is perfectly clear.
Nope. They present a balanced view. They show both sides, the evidence and the unanswered questions.
I respect that. It's a lot more believable when someone acknowledges the challenges instead of trying to ignore them.
I agree. It shows they're being honest and trying to find the truth. They're basically saying that even though we don't have all the answers yet, the evidence we do have is pretty convincing.
It's like a mystery. We have some clues, but we're still waiting for the big reveal.
Exactly. And they're saying, keep an open mind. Keep looking for more discoveries. More evidence might be out there.
They're reminding us that the search for truth is a journey, not a destination.
That's a great way to put it.
Okay, before we move on, I want to go back to the authorship question one more time. We keep coming back to it, but it's at the heart of this whole discussion about the Book of Mormon.
It's the question, isn't it? And your sources tackle it from a lot of different angles. They use so many different types of evidence.
So break it down for me. What are the main ideas about authorship that they present?
Well, like we talked about, they support the traditional view that the Book of Mormon is a collection of ancient records written by different prophets, just like it claims to be.
So multiple authors, not just Joseph Smith.
Right. And they use historical evidence, language analysis, comparisons to other ancient writings, a whole bunch of stuff to back it up.
Okay, like what kind of evidence?
Well, the use of chiasmus is a big one. We've talked about that a lot. It's that complex literary structure found in ancient Hebrew texts, and it's all over the Book of Mormon.
So they're saying it would be very unlikely for Joseph Smith to have come up with that on his own, especially given his limited education.
That's the idea. They say it's pretty much impossible that he could have created such a complex and consistent structure throughout the whole book. Even if he somehow knew about chiasmus, it wouldn't make sense.
Yeah, it doesn't seem like something he could have just pulled off, not with his background.
Right. And there's more. They also talk about stylometry. Remember, that's that statistical technique that analyzes language patterns. It can tell you if there are different authors in a text.
I remember. But how does that apply to the Book of Mormon specifically?
Well, the researchers found patterns that suggest there were multiple authors, just like the Book of Mormon itself says.
Wow. So the analysis supports the book's own internal story.
Exactly. And it makes it really hard to believe that Joseph Smith wrote the whole thing himself out of thin air.
Okay, so chiasmus and stylometry both point to multiple authors. What else? What other angles do they explore?
Well, they also consider the possibility that someone else wrote the book and then just claimed it was Joseph Smith's work.
Interesting. So they're not just defending Joseph Smith. They're also looking at other theories and trying to disprove them.
Right. They're being thorough. They even look at specific people who some have claimed might have written the book. One example is Solomon Spaulding.
Solomon Spaulding. I think I've heard that name before.
Yeah, he was alive at the same time as Joseph Smith. He wrote a historical romance, and some people have said that was the source material for the Book of Mormon.
Oh, I see. What do the sources say about that?
They go into a lot of detail comparing Spaulding's writings with the Book of Mormon, and they really don't match up. Not the style, not the content, not the theological ideas, not even basic historical details. They say there's no real evidence that Spaulding's work had anything to do with the Book of Mormon.
It sounds like they're shutting down that theory pretty definitively.
They are. And they do the same thing with other potential authors. They go through the evidence and show why those theories don't hold up.
It's impressive. It's like they're really trying to cover all the bases and defend the Book of Mormon's authenticity from every angle.
They're definitely doing their homework, and they're doing it with a real commitment to finding the truth, whatever that truth may be.
I think that's what makes this research so valuable. It's not about blindly defending an idea, but about genuinely trying to understand things. And that's something we could all use a little more of.
I agree. It's an invitation to everyone, no matter what they believe, to look at the Book of Mormon with an open mind and to keep learning.
I like that. It reminds me of something we talked about earlier. The search for truth isn't about having all the answers. It's about the journey.
That's a great way to put it.
We've been on quite a journey with the Book of Mormon, haven't we? From chiasmus to statistical analysis and even retracing Lehi's journey.
It's been fascinating. But even after diving into all of this, there's one big question that I bet some folks are still grappling with.
I think you're right. Even with all the evidence we've discussed, there's this one thing you can't escape when you're talking about the Book of Mormon.
Faith.
Exactly. No matter how much evidence you have, it ultimately comes down to this question. Do you believe?
And your sources address that directly. They acknowledge that faith is deeply personal. It's not something you can force or definitively prove.
Are they saying you have to just blindly accept everything and ignore any doubts you have? Is that what they mean by faith?
Not quite. They offer a more nuanced perspective. They suggest that faith and reason can actually work together.
Oh, interesting. So it's not an either-is situation.
Not at all. They argue that evidence can actually make your faith stronger, and at the same time, faith can inspire you to search for a deeper understanding.
Okay, I like that. It's not about shutting down your brain or ignoring your questions. It's about being open to the possibility and then actively looking for more understanding.
Exactly. And that aligns with how they approach their research. They don't just throw facts at you and say, believe this. They present evidence. They explore different sides. They acknowledge when things are complex.
I think that's really important, especially when we're talking about something as personal as faith. It's about encouraging people to honestly search for truth.
Absolutely. And, they also talk about the experiences of people who have found faith in the Book of Mormon, people who have felt its power in their lives and received spiritual confirmation that it's true.
That's a great point. It's acknowledging that personal experience can be just as powerful as external evidence. There's so many ways that people come to believe.
Exactly. And it's an important message for those who might be struggling with doubt or uncertainty. Faith isn't always about having all the answers. It's about being open to the journey, to seeking, to experiencing something beyond what we currently understand.
That's beautifully put. It reminds me of something we've been talking about this whole time, the importance of humility.
Oh, definitely.
Whether it's scientific evidence or personal experience, I think approaching these topics with humility is so important. Being willing to learn, admitting when we don't know something.
Couldn't agree more. And that's how your sources approach this whole topic. They don't claim to have all the answers. They're not forcing anyone to believe anything. They're just sharing the evidence and encouraging us all to engage with the Book of Mormon on our own terms.
That's what makes this deep dive so powerful. It's not about winning an argument. It's about opening up a space for real dialogue, for exploration, for seeking.
Exactly. And remember, the search for truth is a journey, not a destination.
So true. It's a process of asking questions, searching for answers, and being open to new ways of thinking, both intellectually and spiritually.
Love that.
Well, we've reached the end of our deep dive into the world of the Book of Mormon. We've explored the evidence, the arguments, the big questions.
It's been a fantastic journey, and I hope our listeners found it as interesting and thought-provoking as we have.
I'm sure they did. And as always, we encourage you to keep exploring, keep searching for knowledge, challenge your own assumptions, embrace the joy of discovery. You never know what you'll find when you approach the world with an open mind and a curious heart.
If you find value in this exploration, please like, share, follow, and consider becoming a subscriber. Your contributions help keep these conversations going and allows us to maintain the highest quality production. You can find all the details at studyfaithwithai.com. Thank you for being part of this journey.